Welcome, friends and foes, survivors and killers. Let's sit around the campfire together and talk about Dead by Daylight, specifically the stories for Yun-jin Lee and Ji-Woon Hak in Tome IX, Crescendo. I'm going to start by eating a bit of humble pie, because when I saw the leaks that Trickster and Yun-jin were getting the stories for Tome IX instead of older characters like, say, Oni, Fengmin or Ghostface, I was not best pleased. I never liked how smug behaviour seemed to be about Trickster, and how much they kept pushing him to be some big success. Between all the cosmetics, and the animations, and the endless constant tweaks to his kit, I'm sorry, but there's only so much you can polish a turd, even if that turd is lit up with neon strip lighting and wearing a fancy jacket. And the news of him getting a tome almost immediately was another part of that. It was the next stage in their frenzied attempt to squeeze money out of a character that I thought was cynically conceived to market to K-pop stans, at the cost of more interesting or compelling killers who, in my eyes, merited that slot. I was feeling the Trickster fatigue. He'd completely overshadowed my favourite killer, both in terms of balance maintenance and new cosmetics, and the Resident Evil chapter didn't really do anything for me whatsoever, meaning that I basically felt a 9-month content drought between Binding of Kin's release in December 2020 and Pinhead's arrival in September of this year.
Why do women only like jerks who treat them like shit?
Why do guys only want bitchy bimbos who walk all over them?
I had to sit through watching behaviour push Trickster so hard as their newest and sexiest original killer, while the twins rotted on the vine like unpicked fruit. I was resentful and bitter, and I let that colour my judgment of a potential Trickster tome. But now it's here, and I've read it, and I feel a lot more positive about the whole thing. Tome IX, and especially his story Dissonance for the Dead, has succeeded in making me genuinely like the Trickster, and to do so despite his best lore being so dogshit is something I never expected. And it did so by doing something I didn't think they'd have the backbone to do. Effectively throw away his base lore altogether and rebuild his character from the ground up with a totally new focus. I criticised All Kill and its presentation of the Trickster before for not properly exploring the dark world of K-pop that it had the potential to do, and for what it's worth I stand by that criticism. Outside of Yun-jin herself, the actual world of K-pop is barely a footnote in Ji-Woon's story, and this trend continues in the Dissonance for the Dead. But the story's focus shift makes that not really matter, because it more or less abandons any attempt to salvage its old themes and replaces them with better ones. Specifically, it sets itself the unenviable task of making Ji-Woon Hak a threatening presence, and succeeds in it by doing something that his base story never could. They made him an intellectual equal and actual rival to Yun-jin by not just telling us who he is, but by showing us why he does what he does and how he gets away with it. If you read both Trickster and Yun-jin's base stories together, a serious issue crops up that undermines Ji-Woon's level of threat. He really isn't as clever as he thinks he is. The Trickster spends his time kidnapping and torturing his victims, but Yun-jin constantly notices the endless piles of clues and hints he trails behind him, only allowing him to carry on because of denial and a desire to see his career, and thus hers, prosper. You get the sense the story would fall apart without Yun-jin, and Ji-Woon is almost secondary. She outshines him because she's the one who had to clean up after his mess, while he barely acknowledges that she even exists, preferring to live under the delusion that he's smarter than he is. He turns up to the studio recording sessions exhausted. Tour dates line up with the dates of the murders, and the screams he puts in his music sound just like the voices of the victims. And never once in his story is it ever suggested that he's aware that anyone's onto him. He just sort of exists, in ignorance of anything that isn't his obsession with murder and music, in that order. His and Yun-jin's stories run parallel to each other, with Ji-Woon pretty much never acknowledging that she exists. She's goal-oriented and driven by the changing world around her, but he acts entirely on whims, or because the narrative says so. It's like Ji-Woon's part of his own little world where he can do what he wants without consequences, which removes any sense of tension or stakes from his story, especially when compared to Yun-jin's. Tome IX changes it up a bit, and makes the best use out of two closely connected characters by putting them in direct conflict. Both of them have goals, and only one of them can achieve them. Ji-Woon suspects that Yun-jin is investigating him, and his goal is to throw her off his case so he doesn't get caught red-handed, and Yun-jin suspects Ji-Woon is hiding something, and her goal is to discover the truth so his antics don't put her career at risk. Their goals are mutually exclusive. Neither can win without the other one losing, so both sides have stakes to being outwitted by the other one. We have ourselves a core central conflict. We have ourselves a story. The dynamic between them is put on perfect display early in the story, or should I say stories? The first time we get to see their conflict spark is when Yun-jin is caught rifling through Ji-Woon's dressing room and finds his sampler full of incriminating screams. The argument in the hotel room and the prelude to it on both sides sums up perfectly why I like this story so much. Just like their base lore, it tells two sides of the same story, but unlike the base lore, actually shows the conflict between them with how it presents those two sides. Yun-jin's story shows us graphic death threats sent by Trickster's #1 fan. Threats that both put her on high alert for a potential threat to them or their business, and throws a scent off Ji-Woon as the culprit of the murders. We learn in Ji-Woon's story, however, that he sent those death threats. In an act of incredible accidental egotism, he's his own #1 fan, and in his attempts to throw Yun-jin a red herring that prompt her to start looking through his luggage, where she ultimately finds the sampler. Before they even speak to each other, Ji-Woon has interacted more with Yun-jin than he did in his entire base lore beforehand. Instead of just telling us that his privilege affords the benefit of the doubt, the story has shown us how he's gotten away with his crime so far. This makes Ji-Woon's intelligence and scheming nature much more prominent, legitimising him as an actual, tangible threat. Yun-jin, being the determined, industrious manager that she is not fully placated though, and her worries lead her to searching Ji-Woon's luggage, resulting in this fun conflict that we get to see play out from both sides. Ji-Woon explodes at Yun-jin for breaking into his room. Yun-jin fires back about the sampler, and Ji-Woon rolls out a sob story about his heartbreak after the death of his band No Spin. They part ways with both of them ready to put their plans into action. Ji-Woon's aware that he needs to be careful now that Yun-jin's onto him, but he's not sure how much she knows, only that she suspects. And Yun-jin knows she needs to keep investigating because, in Bad News for DBD Twitter, you can't gaslight, gatekeep, girlboss your way out of federal prison. But she's not entirely sure what she's investigating or how much Ji-Woon's aware of it. It's a much more elegant application of the storytelling device used in the original lore, the unreliable narrator. Neither Ji-Woon nor Yun-jin's base stories were told with perfect information. Ji-Woon appeared to believe Yun-jin was on his side in the boardroom, and Yun-jin believed Ji-Woon started the no-spin fire. But crucially, this device was never used very well because the details obscured by this unreliable narration didn't matter. You could cut those bits out and nothing would have meaningfully changed. However, the Crescendo stories make this obstruction of information a core point of both narratives. Because neither of them had the full picture, Ji-Woon has to take extreme measures to keep the true scale of his misdeeds under wraps, and Yun-jin finds herself vulnerable to Ji-Woon's manipulations. And it's these manipulations that allow Ji-Woon's presence as a threat to be truly realised for the first time in this story. Because in their base stories, Yun-jin is clearly the one with the most information, and the most interaction with her counterpart. Her life and decisions are directly shaped by him, but the same is not true the other way around. This highlights Yun-jin's professionalism and resourcefulness. You've got to be attentive in order to survive in the dog-eat-dog world she thrives in. But Ji-Woon never really interacted with her in his own story. She's a footnote in it, a garnish that has next to no influence on his actions. It gives us the impression that Ji-Woon does not have her situational awareness or planning skills, because he has no idea that his own manager is onto him, and makes no effort to hide what he's doing. Reading the story, you begin to imagine him as a bit of an airhead, because he has so little awareness of the world outside his head. and that undermines the serious danger that he poses to those around him. You begin to ask yourself, how has this self-obsessed preening moron gotten away with his crime so far? And the story makes a limp-wristed excuse about his privilege, offering him the benefit of the doubt. But instead of showing us how this happens and how his skills as a manipulator come into play, it just tells us, like it's signing off an item on a checklist. Dissonance for the Dead takes the opposite approach, one that every young writing student would have hopefully had hammered into their brains by now, and that I've brought up a couple of times already in this video. Show, don't tell. Instead of just telling us Ji-Woon didn't get caught because X and Y, it shows us how and why Ji-Woon didn't get caught by showcasing his quick thinking and improvisation skills. He wasn't counting on Yun-jin finding him out, but he was able to concoct a plan on the fly that not only pushed Yun-jin's suspicions away from him, but on to somebody else. It's how this power dynamic shifts into Ji-Woon's favour throughout the story. He starts off with Yun-jin breathing down his neck and manages to completely turn the tables and come out on top by the end. He escapes unharmed. The blame for his murders rests on the shoulders of a dead man, and nobody is any the wiser. A lot of people have described Ji-Woon as Dead by Daylight's answer to American Psycho's Patrick Bateman, and that was something I never really gave much thought to, until the story came out. They do have a lot of similarities. They're both superficially attractive and wealthy serial killers, who demand recognition for their work despite anonymity being necessary to keep committing their murders. Oh, that reminds me, I haven't talked about the hamster scene yet. That was really fucked up, and an excellent way of melding Ji-Woon's sociopathic tendencies with his desire for attention. Even from a young age, Ji-Woon was not able to tolerate being upstaged or anything or anyone stealing his spotlight, and saw nothing wrong with acts of violence to ensure he got the attention that he thought he deserved. This gets a little interesting when you realise that his father actively encouraged Ji-Woon to seek out that spotlight and push him in the direction of becoming a performer, implicitly encouraging Ji-Woon to indulge that egotism and continue that spree of violence. This is another similarity to Patrick Bateman. Something that constantly comes up in American Psycho is Patrick's purported love of music. He's constantly listening to Huey Lewis and the News, Genesis and Whitney Houston, and will wax lyrical about the artistic merit of these artists, who, at least at the time, were universally considered meaningless, easily protestable schlock that appealed only to the lowest common denominator and have no value as works of art whatsoever. He'll expound at great length about the value of pop culture garbage, because to him, music isn't something to be appreciated as a work of art, but part of his facade of normalcy, so he can fit in by talking about what he thinks is insightful and intelligent. And yes, the irony of talking about how shallow and vapid it is to navel gaze for some deep artistic meaning in brain-dead consumerist schlock in a fucking Dead by Daylight lore video is not lost on me. Just like how Ji-Woon used popular music as a vehicle for his egotism and desire for approval, Patrick uses popular music as a vehicle for his absent personality. One of the key defining parts of Bateman in both the book and the film is his hatred of the people in his life he perceives as shallow, stupid, ignorant or uncultured, despite being all those things himself. And yet in his base story, Ji-Woon doesn't really perceive anyone. He's way too absorbed in his own little world to really notice anything going on around him. However, the portrayal of Ji-Woon in Dissonance for the Dead hits the mark on a more Bateman-esque character. Despite craving validation and applause, Ji-Woon seems to have nothing but disdain for the people around him. While he does acknowledge Lucas's vocal talents, he seems to appreciate it more as a new instrument for his use rather than as an appreciation of Lucas as a human being. And in the hotel room, he dismisses Yun-jin as a scared girl afraid of failure. But much like most of Bateman's perceptions, he's wrong. We can see in Chorus of Lies that Yun-jin is not scared at all. His attempts to manipulate her at first completely fail because he does not understand who he's dealing with. Dissonance for the Dead strikes an excellent balance between making Ji-Woon intelligent enough to be taken seriously without making him necessarily smarter than Yun-jin, and it's what makes their conflict interesting. Ji-Woon is a skilled planner and manipulator, whose lack of understanding as to how actual real people work is the biggest spanner in the works of his schemes. And Yun-jin is tenacious and relentless in her pursuit of the truth, but is held back by the potential consequences of looking for something she doesn't really want to find. Speaking of which, I want to talk about Yun-jin briefly, but only briefly because there's not actually a huge amount to say. Yun-jin hasn't really changed much since her portrayal in her base lore, which is great because she didn't need to change. Her lore and character was fine as it was. She's professional, tenacious, and self-interested, but not malicious. It's clear that she has no real ideological belief in what she's doing. She produces music that she hates with people she despises, and drinks to deal with the stress of it all. There's not really a lot to say about her because, well, I've already said it in a prior video. So if you want to hear my more nuanced takes about Yun-jin, you can go back and watch that one. What makes Yun-jin's story interesting, however, is the little details. For example, Yun-jin crashes her car, buying Ji-Woon the time to set up his ruse, because she gets smashed on caipirinhas at the hotel bar before following him to Lucas's car. And the concerns from Mighty One's top brass about Ji-Woon's crazed and potentially murderous fans adds further plausible deniability to Trickster's alibis, because the notion of an obsessive fan stalking them becomes much more reasonable in this context. It's unclear how much Ji-Woon knew about these alleged murderous fans or if they're even real, but if they're legit and not just fabrications that he made to cover his tracks, that adds a whole extra dimension to his character. But instead of merely being a performer obsessed with making his masterpieces, the Trickster becomes something more like a demagogue, a leader of a literal murder cult of personality, with himself as a central figure of worship. If Ji-Woon's use of real-life screams and horrifying material in his videos is provoking acts of violence in his fanbase, that's a super interesting angle, because in basically all portrayals of mad artists in fiction, the artist is typically the only one suffering under their delusions of grandeur. I can't tell you how much I love the idea of Ji-Woon's stans being as murderous and vicious as he is. The notion of his cruelty and madness spreading like an infection through his music. We all know the dangerous lengths that truly devoted fans can go to in the name of their idols, especially the legendarily obsessive K-pop community. By doubling down on his genuinely threatening elements, this story has also tied Ji-Woon directly into the world of K-pop in a way that his base lore tried and failed to do, by giving him a legion of dedicated fans who exist both as an alibi for him to hide behind and potentially a cult-like following, willing to die or even kill for him. Dead by Daylight's other truly vile killers became who they were due to isolation. The Doctor isolated himself from others because he values them only as playthings to be experimented on, and the Clown was forcibly isolated from his family and grew up unable to connect to anyone. But Ji-Woon was never isolated. He was encouraged into his work by his father. He's reliant on Yun-jin to basically manage his life as an idol for him, and he's cultivated an army of obsessed disciples to help him hide his violent excesses, intentionally or otherwise. It's what makes Ji-Woon so interesting in this story. He's defined by how much he interacts with the world around him, which is a stark contrast to his original appearance, where he seemed to mostly live in a world of his own. His original lore was largely an attempt to justify his existence, kinda like the stories of the old killers. They shoehorned in the knife-throwing in his youth to explain away his power. They gave him his nonsensical artist name to justify his equally nonsensical killer title and trotted him out in front of everyone like bread taken out of the oven before it had a chance to rise. But Dissonance for the Dead, and how elements of him are presented in Chorus of Lies, effectively decided to throw all that away and start again. The priority here isn't to explain the parts of him that don't make sense at face value, but to flesh him out as a person and give us something to feel about him. He's scarier now than he's ever been, but instead of the story just telling us he didn't get caught, he's shown to be an intelligent man, capable of planning and executing complex schemes to remain undetected. He's more unique than he's ever been, because instead of the story just telling us that he puts real screaming into his music, and that Mighty One cut back on his excesses, It shows us the effects of Ji-Woon's dark and violent compositions through the stress it inflicts on yun-jin and the dangerously obsessive fans willing to take credit for his killings or even perpetrate some themselves. By liberating itself from the burdens the behaviour inflicted on the base lore, Tome IX manages to not just spectacularly augment the Trickster story, but effectively replace it. If I showed Dissonance for the Dead to someone who had no idea who the Trickster was, they'd be able to get a complete and interesting perspective on his character without the need to ever touch his base lore. Everything from his father encouraging his showbiz career, to his knife obsession, to the no-spin fire, to his love of gaudy and expensive fashion, to his narcissism. All of it is put on perfect display in this story. In hindsight, this makes his base lore mean literally nothing anymore, because Dissonance for the Dead covers everything that the base lore does much more effectively, and adds new elements like the insane devotion of his fanbase, the alibis he feeds yun-jin, and the intimations that, even as a child, his sociopathic tendencies were already starting to take shape. My distaste for the Trickster is extremely well documented, but since this story it's been almost completely cured by Tome IX. It feels like I've been prescribed new glasses and see him properly, without the blur of a poorly written story obscuring the details. Dissonance for the Dead effectively rebuilds him into a brand new character, with all the gaudy flair and egotism of the original lore, but built more completely into the world of K-pop and realised as a frightening serial killer much more authentically. I genuinely didn't think Behaviour knew how to save the Trickster, especially with a tome coming out so soon after his release. But they seem to have pulled it off, so I'll happily be magnanimous and actually say the Trickster is pretty great now. And that gives me a lot of hope, because there are several characters with base lore that just doesn't work who could, and I would say should, be on the docket for the same treatment in future tomes. Feng Min, the artist, Michaela Reed, and Jonah Vasquez. None of them have received a tome yet, and if any of them were to get stories in the future on the level of the Faceth Trickster received, then I'd be a very happy lore guy indeed. But we're not going to get those for quite some time. Because with the next mid-chapter fast approaching, we've learned who's going to be getting the next instalment of the archive stories in Tome X. For anybody who isn't aware, the killer and survivor are Amanda Young and Detective David Tapp. Yeah, baby, we're getting a Saw tome, and I'm exactly as happy as you might think I am. But will it be as good as Tome IX? Only time will tell. But for now I say bravo and encore, because for once, Behaviour's tome writers put on a show I'm not forgetting for a very long time. So yeah, that's everything I have to say about the frankly exceptional Tome IX Crescendo. If you found this video to be of some value to you, then please do consider subscribing. Check out my Twitter, Twitch, Patreon, Ko-fi and Discord links all in the description as well. With this one out of the way, there's 3 videos I want to make for a hell of a long time that I really want to get done before the mid-chapter comes in January. At some point in December, you'll be expecting my Pinhead guide that I promised ages ago, and I will also be producing another episode of my Saw analysis series, talking about the original Saw this time. But before either of those, I want to have a bit of a discussion about the concept of fun and fairness in Dead by Daylight, so that'll be coming in the next video. So I guess I'll see you then. Ta-ta for now.